You are about to meet a remarkable woman, Clara Colby, a midwife of bridge feminism in the Gilded Age. I'm Joy Massoff, and I'll be your host.
Sometimes it's not enough to be gifted, visionary, and brilliant. It's not enough to count some of the luminaries of your era as your friends and confidants, or to dedicate your life to the pursuit of equal rights and a higher ethical plane of living. Sometimes extraordinary people get buried by the weight of the past or disenfranchised because there's no convenient slot in which to place them.
Clara Colby was one such woman. Colby was a journalist, a publisher, an entrepreneur, a suffragist, a philosopher, poet, and spiritual ideologue. She was also a full-blown cultural feminist long before the words existed.
My essay focuses on Colby's life, set against the Gilded Age and the early progressive eras, the years between 1880 and the start of World War I.
This was a period of tremendous change, of waves of immigration and rapid industrialization. It was a time of urbanization and unionization. There were tremendous inequities between the very rich in their lavish homes and the have-nots living in crumbling tenements or sod houses on the treeless plains. America was changing dramatically, but women were still held in an antiquated limbo, still voiceless in the goings-on of their own lives, their communities, and their nation's future. And so, even though they could not vote, some women took it upon themselves to speak out and take action. Clara Colby was one of those women. Clara Colby believed that women had the power to create a better world. She was a cultural feminist in every sense of the word. Ellen Willis, a 1970s social critic, described cultural feminism as freeing women from the imposition of so-called male values and creating an alternative culture based on female values. In a nutshell, cultural feminism is essentially a moral, countercultural movement aimed at redeeming its participants.
All of this brings me to the word feminism, a word that is sometimes loaded with a lot of heavy baggage. Historians describe three waves of feminism.
Colby's tale begins with first-wave feminism. We all know of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott and Sojourner Truth. We speak of these women as first-wave feminists. We've heard about Seneca Falls and seen photos of suffrage parades and the push towards the 19th Amendment. In the late 1960s, second-wave feminism grabbed news headlines as Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm demanded a dialogue about equal rights and opportunities that went beyond voting. The designation of cultural feminist became an actual thing.
You may be wondering why an enormous gap exists between the two movements. I did too. I believe that a new designation needs to be created.
Clara Colby was born 2 years before the Seneca Falls Convention. She died 3 years before the 19th Amendment became the law. She was a full-blown feminist at a time when that designation did not exist. But even though the word to describe it was just making its way into the lexicon, its spirit was in full bore, and she was actively spreading its message. But there were a group of women who moved the dialogue beyond the topic of voting rights, towards a feminist gestalt that envisioned a new way of doing things, the empowering of women in the spiritual realm, the staking of a claim for economic independence, and an aggressive engagement in civic betterment. And the women who pushed toward these goals found themselves alienated from the purer suffragists. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association merged into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The new organization had a single-minded focus on the vote, to the detriment of women like Colby, who viewed women's rights as a much broader issue.
As the historiography of the women's rights movement grew, Colby became described as a radical fringe suffragist, and there she remains in the historical record. But the truth is that she was part of a new movement, propelled by a new energy simmering from within. And she was not the only one. There was a great awakening from within the movement as feminism firmly took root.
Women were breaking barriers, despite their inability to vote in most places. College attendance by women grew, as did the attainment of professional credentials. Women became doctors, lawyers, and members of the clergy. Clara Colby's professional credentials included journalist and lecturer, and she was the owner of one of the most important suffrage newspapers in America until the merger between the NWSA and AWSA. For 26 years, to the point of impoverishment, Colby printed the Women's Tribune, all the while subtly inculcating her readers with her own cultural feminist viewpoint. It was within the Tribune's pages that her unique relationship with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony best expressed itself. I first met Clara Colby while wandering through the rare books and documents gallery at the Huntington Library. She sat just past the Gutenberg Bible, on the right, nothing more than a name on a small card in a glass case. I looked her up in Google and found an underwhelming amount of information, so I applied for privileges to use the library to learn more. I first came to know Colby through letters written to her by her readers, her friends, and especially the boxes of letters from Susan B. Anthony, a surrogate mother to Colby in many ways. Over the next weeks, I spent several days at the Huntington, much of it spent trying to decipher Anthony's terrible handwriting. I learned so much about Colby by what others were writing to her. I think that even if I had never read a word Colby herself wrote, I would understand the kind of person she was, her passions, her unflagging optimism, and the inquisitiveness and expansiveness of her mind. My second major source was the Wisconsin Historical Society, where the bulk of Colby's papers are kept. I ordered copies of the lectures she delivered, her notes on theology and spirituality, and photos of the Indian daughter that her faithless husband thrust upon her and then abandoned. The third primary resource were the dozens of editions of the Women's Tribune, the suffrage newspaper Colby owned, edited, and often wrote articles for. From all of this, a flesh and blood person emerged before me. To anchor the primary source materials, I turned to titles that discuss the earliest stirrings of cultural feminism, the spiritual shifts taking place at the time, and the personal traumas Colby endured at the hands of her duplicitous and scheming husband.
My thesis suggests that because the word feminist as a self-identifier was brand new at the time, Colby's contributions and those of her peers were relegated to the shadows of women's history. But their contributions demand that the existing feminist hierarchy be reevaluated and reconfigured. And so I propose a new category, bridge feminism, to be added to the current designations between first and second generation feminism.
These were women who looked beyond suffrage to exemplify the newly coined title of feminist. There was Florence Kelley, a progressive-era reformer focused on using women-powered social reform to effect changes in child labor laws. Anna Howard Shaw was a physician, one of the first ordained Methodist ministers in the United States. Matilda Joslyn Gage was an outspoken religious iconoclast and spiritual activist determined to end biases in religion. And Clara Shortridge Foltz was the first woman lawyer on the West Coast and the inventor of the public defender program. Colby was a contemporary of Jane Addams, who advocated for newly arrived immigrant women and who was the guiding force behind the settlement house movement. She was friends with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer, philosopher, lecturer, and the author of Women in Economics, and very close friends with Marilla Marx Ricker, a suffragist, freethinker, lawyer, political activist, and philanthropist.
My research tells two stories. The first lifts a remarkable woman out of obscurity. The second places her firmly in the midst of changing times within the women's movement. Together, these two separate threads weave a tale of accomplishments that cannot be ignored or explained away. This all seems so obvious to me, so I keep asking myself why I, a newly hatched historian, am the only one who seems to recognize this historical oversight. So I intend to dig a little more deeply into the relationships between Colby and the other prominent feminists. There's more to these two intertwining stories, and I cannot wait to present and argue my findings to the women's studies community and pull Colby and her peers out of the shadows.